Hi and welcome along to this session. What I want to look at today is virtual machines. What is a virtual machine? How do they fit into today's computers and networks? Where do we use them? Why do we use them? And things like that. Now, what I've got in front of me is a general diagram of a small network. Here we've got the internet. We connect to the internet usually via an internet service provider. In this day and age, you've probably got some sort of NBN connection or maybe an older ADSL connection. That would normally be installed by NBN Co within your house or your premises or your property or your business. We would connect our router to the NBN box, and the NBN box is usually going to be some sort of modem or something like that. Our router will, well, if it's a home router these days, will probably have wireless capabilities. Businesses may or may not. Connected to our router, we would normally have a switch, and what you can see here is connected to my switch I have multiple computer desktops. Okay. What I have over here is just another desktop, but what I've done with this particular desktop is I've expanded it somewhat so that we can see we have hardware on the left hand side and this area here. So this is my hardware down here on the left hand side, and this area here would be my monitor or what's on my display. Right, let me just clear a few of these things off. Okay, get rid of that, get rid of that. And what I want to do is I want to have a closer look at this particular machine that I've drawn up here. So let's have a look at that. This is our computer. Okay, it's connected to the switch. Let me just get rid of some of that. Colouring out, one of my favourite things. Right, so if this is our computer, let me just make it slightly bigger, not too big. Now, within our computer, traditionally when we installed an operating system, what we did is we would take our operating system installation media, which traditionally was always a DVD disc. Now it might be a USB thumb drive or whatever, but it will have the Windows installation media on it, and we would install our operating system directly onto the hardware. So our operating system will get installed directly onto the hardware. Let's do that then. So let me do what is effectively going to be my operating system here. Okay, so there's my Windows 10 operating system, which has been installed directly onto the hardware. Where would it go? Well, it's pretty much going to reside here. Okay, the necessary files from the Windows 10 installation media, which might have been my DVD here, would get copied to my hard drive or solid state drive or whatever sort of storage I've got. When I start my computer, the necessary files get loaded from the hard drive into the memory. Your operating system uses a percentage of your memory. This is a standard computer scenario. Now, what I want to look at is I want to look at a virtual machine. What's the difference between a virtual machine and a physical machine? Well, one's physical, one isn't. I'll give you a guess which one isn't. The virtual one. Right, so in the case of a virtual machine, what we do is we already have our computer, and we usually already have a host operating system installed. So if in this case here, Windows 10 would be our host operating system. Now, within our Windows 10 operating system, we can install applications. You've probably done it. To set up virtual machines, we need to install a particular type of application. The general type of application we're talking about is called a hypervisor. Classic examples of hypervisor would be Hyper-V. Comes with Windows 10, not all versions. It certainly comes with your professional versions, your business versions, your enterprise versions. Doesn't necessarily come with your home versions. Oracle do one called VirtualBox, which is free and quite easy to use. VMware is one of the other main players in the hypervisor market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw up my hypervisor, which, as with any other application, you can install that application within your operating system. Okay, so there's my hypervisor. Excuse my dodgy writing. And it might be VirtualBox. It could be Hyper-V, whatever. They all operate basically the same. Once you've got your hypervisor installed, which is, as I said, effectively just an application, it would usually be installed on top of Windows or within Windows, although there are some hypervisors which can be installed directly onto the hardware. Within your hypervisor, you would then have the ability to create what's called a virtual machine. So let's say, for example, I create a virtual machine inside my hypervisor. Okay, I'm going to call it, so this might be VM1, and it might be running Windows 7. Okay. I might have more than one virtual machine created within my hypervisor within VirtualBox. So let's get creative with the naming. Let's call this one VM2, and that might be running server 2016, for example. I might have VM3, which might be running a version of Linux, Kali or something like that. So, one of the big advantages of using virtualization and setting up virtual machines is we can have one physical machine with our host operating system running in it. There we go, Windows 10. And within that, we can run multiple virtual machines. And we can use them to test and do all sorts of things without having to uninstall and reinstall our host operating system. Traditionally, if I wanted to test out Server 2016, I might have to uninstall my Windows 10 and then install Server 2016. Or I could set up what might be called dual boots or multi-boots, where I have multiple operating systems installed onto the one computer. The beauty about virtual machines is they're very easy to back up. You can delete them, you can do all sorts of things to them, and they will generally not affect your host operating system. So for testing purposes, they're fantastic. For learning purposes, they're fantastic. Now, when I create virtual machines within my hypervisor, the hypervisor will effectively, via the operating system, via the host operating system, should I say, access the hardware. So what I might do when I create this particular virtual machine, say the Windows 7 virtual machine, I might assign 2 GB of RAM to this virtual machine. What that means is, whenever this virtual machine is started, okay, so when I start this virtual machine, what it's going to do is it's going to grab, and let's say my physical RAM, I have 16 gigabytes of physical RAM. When I start this virtual machine, it's going to grab 2 gigabytes of my physical memory, which is going to be in use by this virtual machine. When I shut this virtual machine down, this particular 2 gigabytes of memory will be released, and it will be available for my host operating system or anything else to use. Right. Now, what else do we have here as far as hardware? Okay, we've got CPU, we've got RAM, we've got hard drives or storage, possible optical drive, network adapters. When we set up our virtual machine, we can configure our virtual machine to use all of these. The next main thing that I'm really interested in though is storage. Because at the moment what we have here is we have a virtual machine with 2 gigs of memory allocated, and it doesn't have any operating system installed. It's like a computer without anything installed. So what we need to do is we need to add a hard drive. And when we add a hard drive to a computer, we go out and we buy a physical drive, we plug it into the appropriate serial ATA or M2 slot or whatever it is, and it then shows up. In the case of a virtual machine, what we do is we create a virtual hard drive, and we might assign, say, a 40 gigabyte hard drive. Now, what this is going to be, it's going to be a single file. Okay, so this 40 gigabytes of hard drive is effectively, in our particular physical machine, it's going to create a single file which, when we create our virtual hard drive, we will give it a name. We might call it win7.vhd. And that particular extension is a virtual hard disk file, would be commonly used with Microsoft virtual machines, or some of the new ones might be VHDX. Within VirtualBox, it can recognize these VHD files, or it might be a VDI file or whatever, but it's a virtual hard disk file. And this particular 40 gigabyte virtual hard disk, which we create inside our virtual machine, is going to point to an actual file stored on our physical machine storage. Okay. And this particular file would be 40 gigabytes in size. Now, you can configure that so that 40 gigabytes is the maximum size, but it will only use as much space as actually used on this hard drive. So when we install Windows 7, if it's only using 15 gigabytes, then it'll only take up 15 gigabytes of space over here. Okay, don't stress about that too much, but it can use up to 40 gigabytes. If we configure this as 100 gigabytes, then over here it could take up to 100 gigabytes. Okay. Right, so what we do is we literally create a virtual hard disk file, which is an actual file on our computer. Okay, it'll be stored on our storage. Over here for our server machine, we might have 4 gigabytes of RAM, and we might configure it with a 50 gigabyte hard drive. Okay, this particular 50 gigabyte hard drive will correspond to a 50 gigabytes, and we might call this srv16.vhd. Let's say it's a VHDX, which is the updated version of the file. So this will link to that particular file. If I can get my arrow pointing right, there we go. And so on with our Kali Linux. We would create RAM, we would create a VHD, a hard drive, which would link to a similar file over here. Right. Just want to get rid of a couple of those lines. You get the idea now. Okay, what other hardware do we have on our computer? Yeah, we've got a CPU, and our CPU might have however many cores, and we can then configure virtual machines to use one or more cores of your CPU. We might have 4 gigabytes of memory set aside for our server machine over here. And the next thing is DVD drive, because what we have now is we've got a virtual machine, and we'll just look at this particular Windows 7 virtual machine here. So we've got a virtual machine which has been assigned 2 gigabytes of memory, a 40 gigabyte hard drive, and it doesn't have an operating system yet. The other thing we need to do before installing an operating system, which we might do via a DVD, is we need to set up a network. Actually, you can set up that after doing the operating system. It won't really matter. But what we can do is, in our virtual machine, we can configure an optical drive. So we might say, yes, this virtual machine has a DVD drive, and the DVD drive in this virtual machine is going to link directly to the DVD drive in the physical machine. What that will mean is when you stick an actual DVD in the physical drive, it will show up as if it's in this particular DVD drive in the virtual machine, which will allow us to put in a Windows 7 disk here and install the operating system into this virtual machine here. Alternately, you might configure it with a USB drive, and you might configure a USB drive here to correspond to a USB drive here. So you've got a USB drive in your virtual machine which corresponds to USB in your physical machine. Or you might configure your DVD drive. What you might have is, you might have again another file on your hard drive, Win7 enterprise.iso. An ISO file is like an image of a CD. Okay. So what you might do is you might configure the DVD drive on the virtual machine to point to an image of a CD stored on your hard drive, or solid state drive as the case may be. What that will look like is, it will look like you've just installed the Windows 7 Enterprise disk into a DVD drive here. So there's a number of ways you can do that. Right, so let me just tidy that up a little bit. Right, the last thing I really want to look at is network. So what I can do is, on my virtual machine will have network, and you can usually go to the virtual machine and configure one or more network adapters. So there's a number of ways you can configure the network on a virtual machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a switch in here. Within your hypervisor or your virtual machine environment, you can usually set up one or more switches. Some hypervisors make it pretty clear that you're setting up virtual switches. Others will allow you to configure this network interface here. So you might have one or more virtual switches, and these virtual switches are set up differently. You might have it set up so that you configure this virtual machine's network interface here to connect to one of these switches, and this particular switch might be set up to actually connect to your computer's physical network adapter. If you set it up like that, what you are doing is you are going to allow this particular virtual machine to use the virtual network interface to go out via the physical network interface and out onto your physical network and quite possibly out onto the internet. So you can give a virtual machine external access. EXT for external access outside of the virtual machine. So that's one option. Another option might be you might have a particular virtual machine. So we've got a virtual machines network interface here. This one has a virtual machine network interface. So here we go. Network. And both of these might be connected to a different virtual switch, and this particular virtual switch might be an internal network only. In other words, what that means is this particular switch might only allow VM to VM communication, whereas this one might allow VM to VM to EXT for external. It's a dodgy looking external as well, but I'm sick of redrawing it. Okay. So I could have this connected here as well. So what that will allow is that will allow this virtual machine to communicate with this one and vice versa by going through this pathway here. It will also allow either of these virtual machines to go out onto the physical network, as you can see there. Right. This one over here, however, the virtual machine to virtual machine or internal only one, will only allow virtual machines to communicate with other virtual machines. It does not have an external connection. Okay, so this particular one does not have an external connection here. That doesn't exist. So let me just rub that out as I go. There we go. This virtual machine to virtual machine option is a really good option where you just want to set stuff up and test it, and you don't want to have to deal with licensing or internet or anything like that. It sets up a closed sandbox environment, if you like, where you can do whatever you want without risk of it going out onto the internet. Okay, great for testing, and you can set up your own networks and install servers and clients and join them and set up domains and all sorts of things. Right, so that is a bit of a rundown on our virtual machine. What is a virtual machine? Well, a virtual machine is, just use one of these. So a virtual machine, such as what I've got here, is effectively software pretending to be hardware. Okay. This is software running inside a hypervisor which has access to our physical hardware. So why would you use virtual machines? Well, there's a number of reasons why, I suppose. From a classroom type environment, it's great for testing and learning. You can set up virtual machines, and let's make that a little bit smaller. Okay. So you can set up virtual machines and you can test and learn and install, uninstall, delete. You can muck around with it and you can try this and try that without risk of ruining your operating system. In a business environment, okay, as your business grows, you tend to need servers. Okay, and traditionally, the bigger your business grew, the more servers you need. So you might end up with 10, 12 more servers, which gets quite expensive. Instead of running 12 servers, what companies used to do is they just run a couple of servers, and within those servers they would run multiple virtual machines, like you see here, VM1, VM2, VM3. Although what it might be, VM1 might be server 2019 domain controller 1, VM2 might be server 2019 domain controller 2, VM3 might be server 2019 exchange server, VM4 might be server 2019 domain name server and things like that. So you might have multiple servers all running on the one machine. So instead of having lots of servers, what you'd get is one or two big servers, and in those one or two big servers you would have lots of CPU power, you would have lots of memory, lots of storage, and nice fast network adapters. Okay. It worked out to be a cheaper option. Now that has evolved. Okay, it's evolved with the cloud. So what is the cloud? So let me just make that a little bit smaller. So traditionally our servers resided on our networks. Okay, so it resided somewhere within our networks. We had our servers. Nowadays our servers don't reside on our networks. Nowadays what we tend to do is we tend to have our servers sitting somewhere in here on the internet. The cloud is basically instead of storing your data on your servers in your network, you're now storing your data on virtual servers running in someone else's data center. Okay, so somewhere else you've got a big data center, okay, and these data centers have full-time power backups, generators and everything else. So if there's power goes out, then the data centers are going to be available. They have multiple high-speed connections to the internet, and inside these data centers they have big servers, lots of big servers, and inside these big servers might be a virtual machine. And this particular virtual machine here, make it a bit bigger, whoops, so this particular virtual machine here might actually be where our data is stored. So we would have full control of this particular virtual machine here sitting in someone else's data center, possibly even in a different country, and we would have full control of that, and we would access that via the internet. Okay, so the advantage of having virtualized servers sitting in someone else's data center is it's very quick and easy for them to set up your servers. They are now backing up your data for you. They are maintaining it. If this particular server over here in the data center went down, so if this particular server here went down, the data center has multiple servers. And what we've got running on one of their servers is generally going to be duplicated to multiple servers. So if one server dies, our data is still going to be there. We're not going to lose access to it. It's going to be running on multiple servers at the same time. So you have the ability to always access your data. So your servers are no longer sitting here in your network. They're now sitting in someone else's data center in some other network, probably somewhere else in the world. Okay. If a computer here needs to access data, it literally goes via the internet, boing, 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 bounces around the internet, comes down here to our data. So that's where virtualization actually starts to kick in. But if we come back here, we're not interested in the large scale at the moment. We're more interested in this initially. When you take your machine, you take your hardware, you install a host operating system on the hardware, then within the host operating system you install a hypervisor, be it VirtualBox, be it whatever, and then from within your hypervisor you can set up one or more virtual machines for whatever purpose you might need. Right, let me see if I can bring one up to just give us a minute. Let me start VirtualBox. Okay, so here's VirtualBox. You can see here within VirtualBox I've managed to create a whole lot of new groups, but never mind. Within VirtualBox I have multiple servers. I've got 2 servers, server 1, server 2. It's currently showing up as powered off, and within, if I just select server 1 here, you can see over here under system I've got 2 gigs of memory. Under storage it's showing me as server01.vdi, which is a 50 gigabyte hard drive. This 50 gigabyte hard drive here will actually reside on my physical hard drive. Okay. Network, this particular network adapter is set up as NAT, network address translation. That is within VirtualBox. That will give it external access, but it will set it up as its own network. This other one is set up as an internal network. Okay, so that'll be virtual machine to virtual machine only. If I have a look at client 1 over here, you can see it's got Windows 10 installed. Okay, it's got 2 gigabytes of memory. I can make that bigger or smaller if I want. Oops, make it smaller. Up to a maximum of 16 gigabytes, because that's how much memory my computer has at the moment. Okay, I have a 50 gigabyte VHD hard drive there, and the optical drive is showing up as empty. I can choose a disk file, which is the ISO image that I was talking about before. Otherwise, it's by default, I think, set to use my physical computer's optical drive. Right, so that gives you a bit of an idea. Let me just close VirtualBox. Now, VirtualBox here, if I can show you, is, see if I can make it a bit smaller. Okay, oh, there we go. So VirtualBox, let me just close my whiteboard. So there we go, there's VirtualBox. It is an application running within my Windows. Okay, so this is my Windows 10 here. Okay, this is VirtualBox. It's my hypervisor running within Windows. And then within my hypervisor, I have one or more virtual machines, and my virtual machines are configured with varying amounts of memory, storage, networks configured in different ways, and so on. I can actually go to settings for this virtual machine, and you can see how much memory it's got, you can see how much storage it's got. See, win7x64.vhd is my VHD file. Okay, the size is 30 gigabytes. The actual size is 7.65 gigabytes, and it's stored here, C:users temp VirtualBox. So this is where that file is actually stored. So I can probably bring it up if I go this way a bit. C:users temp, probably that one. I created all those groups, but you can see here client1.vdi. That might not be the one I'm looking for, but nonetheless. But this particular file here, this file represents my virtual disk image. Okay. Inside there is the Windows operating system. So if we have a look here, oh, this is actually client 2, which is Windows 7. So the Windows 7 operating system is installed in a VDI file. Client 1, the Windows 10 operating system, new group, new group, new group, new group, new group. Yeah, I got a bit carried away with making all those new groups. Right, that'll do for the moment. I hope it's been beneficial. Thanks very much for watching.